Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to my host here at Education City for bringing me halfway around the world to speak with you guys today. I'm quite honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to a really fantastic conference. I enjoyed the heck out of Philip's talk just now. Lots of good stuff to chew on, and I'm going to hope to kind of follow up on that with a few different ideas. Let me do a quick, yeah, we're good there, okay. So my talk is called Technologies for Learning, Creative Active Learning Environments in Today's Classroom, and I'll use the term classroom rather loosely here to refer to physical spaces as well as other learning spaces. If you want to follow along with my slides or reference them later, I've already put them up on my website at derekbruff.org, derekbruff.org. I'm using a presentation tool called Prezi here, and as you see as I go through today, you'll see a few links embedded in the presentation. So if you want to follow up on those links later, you can get them from my website. I'm also pretty active on Twitter, at Derek Bruff. Feel free to tweet during the talk here today. Try to say nice things about me. And if you would, use the hashtag that's been set up for this conference. So it's # THE 2013. That way we'll be able to find each other's tweets very easily. If you don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. But if you do, I'd encourage you. So a bit about me. As Jenny said, I direct the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University. And so a lot of my work revolves around helping faculty, helping professors to be more effective teachers. We work a lot with junior faculty who are kind of learning the ropes and learning how to teach. We work a lot with senior faculty who are trying out new things in the classroom, continuously improving what they do. And so my focus in this talk is going to be mostly around kind of teaching and learning. What I'm going to try to do is talk about a few key principles of learning that, as we think about using technology in face-to-face settings, in online settings, in hybrid settings, in MOOCs, on some level, our brains are still our brains, right? Learning still happens in certain ways. And so what I want to do is to talk about some of these key learning principles and then talk about ways they can be enhanced or kind of tapped into using technology in different settings. So I'm going to try to kind of focus us on these key learning principles as a way to think about how we might choose to use technology in various different settings. So I hope for those of you who are teaching, I hope that you'll find some kind of inspiration and ideas here today. For those of you who are more on the IT side, I hope you'll have a better sense of the education in education technology. So that's kind of where we're going today. So one other little preamble here. I will point out, I think I'm OK to commit to naming my favorite educational technology. That would be wheels on chairs. There's a lot of technology in this room. This technology is not in this room, actually. Your chairs don't go anywhere. I'm a huge fan of flexibility and of using the physical space in many different ways. If I had to just pick one in my own, I teach math. If I just had one, maybe even over clickers, I would pick wheels on chairs so that we can do what we need to every day in class and not be constrained by the physical environment we're in. It's one of the things that technology helps us do, right, is to kind of overcome those constraints. So, but most of the technologies I will mention today do have power cords and or internet connections. So we're mostly digital here today. So this is kind of where we're going. I wanted to give you kind of the big picture. We're going to look at a few key principles and some applications as we go. And we'll use those clickers that you may have found on your seats. So we'll get to that in just a second. So the first principle I want to talk about is something that Schwartz and Bransford call times for telling. And I think this is a really kind of fundamental thing that we don't think a lot about when we're preparing lessons. So does anyone know what that image is? Have you seen this before? Mentos and Diet Coke. Yes. No, you say Pepsi, which is kind of interesting. So let me come back to that in a second. So if you go on YouTube and search for Mentos and Diet Coke, Mentos is a breath mint, Diet Coke is the soda. You take Mentos and you kind of roll the breath mints into the 2-liter of Diet Coke, and then it goes kablooey, right? It's just this geyser of foam. It's quite exciting. I did this a few years ago. Gosh, it's been a while now. My 9-year-old, when she was in preschool, they had science day at the preschool, and so I was the cool dad that brought in the exploding soda to show them this. And the reason I show you this image, and you'll see a lot of images today. I try to do a lot with images to kind of represent ideas visually and conceptually. The reason I share this with you is that even with 5-year-olds, when I did this in front of them, they were curious to know why it works, right? Now, I couldn't go into all the chemistry and the physics of it, but I could say there are bubbles in the soda, and when you put the Mentos there, the bubbles get together very quickly, and they have to go somewhere, and they have to escape. So I could kind of get into it a little bit. In a freshman physics or chemistry class, you might actually go into a lot more of the details here. The other thing that's kind of interesting, Philip, you said Pepsi. It's always Diet Coke on YouTube. I don't know why it's always Diet Coke. I haven't figured this out. It's never Coke. It's never Coke Zero. It's never Pepsi. It's always Diet Coke. So I'm kind of curious, actually, is it, if you varied that parameter, would you have different results? I don't know. So, and the reason I bring this times for telling is that after you've done this thing, right, then the students are interested in knowing why. They're ready for the explanation. And I'm going to talk a lot about active learning today. I think there's a real place for lecture and explanation in active learning. But I think you have to set students up so that they're actually kind of ready to understand and interested in knowing your explanation. So let me talk about how you can use one tool to do this, clickers. So these are these classroom response systems. We scattered them throughout the auditorium today. So hopefully somewhere near you is a clicker. It looks like this. We're going to use them a couple of times here today in this talk. Okay? So you don't have to have one yourself. But if you can be close to someone who does, that would be nice. Okay, so you may move around. We got them all over the place. So there's like a whole kit and caboodle in the back that no one will use. But hopefully we have enough to go around. Not absolutely essential, but if you could either have a clicker or be close to someone who does. So let me maybe do this by demonstration. I'm going to start with, I'm going to put you in math class here for a second. So I teach a probability and statistics course. So this is a clicker question I will often ask my students during the early parts of the course. So let me read it, and then I'll open voting, and then I'll give you some instructions. Your sister calls to say she's having twins. Which of the following is more likely? Assume she's not having identical twins. Is it more likely she's having twin boys, twin girls, one girl and one boy, or are all of those equally likely? Now let me open voting here. Oops. There we go. That's what I want. Okay. Now, what I want you to do, everyone's voting already. Okay. Think about this just for a minute. I'm going to do kind of an abbreviated version of what I usually do. Think about this just for a minute, kind of get an answer in your head, and then talk about it with someone around you. Okay? Put your heads together, talk about it, see if you can come up with the right answer, and when you're ready, use your clicker to vote. Okay? So those of you who have clickers, you're going to vote for your little group. Okay? Go. I'll give you like 30 seconds. Take them. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. If you would go ahead and vote for your team. It looks like most people have already gone in. I think we only have like 104 clickers in the room, so most of you are there. But go ahead and register your vote for your team if you haven't already. I'll also point out right now, I'll try to say this again later, please don't walk away with your clickers. They are not a gift to you today. You received a wonderful bag when you checked in. The clickers are not part of your swag, so leave them at your chairs when you're done. Yes, not particularly useful by themselves either. I have a little receiver unit up here that's part of the package. Okay, so let's see what you guys are thinking about this. Okay. So a couple of you have unusual answers. Most of you went with C or D, one boy and one girl. The more popular answer was all are equally likely. Now, what I do in my own class is I typically take a little bit more time with this. I have students kind of think on their own. They vote on their own. I have one clicker per student. We look at the bar graph. Sometimes I show it to them, sometimes I don't. Depends on what it looks like. This is a nice bar graph. It kind of shows that there's some contention around this question, so I probably would show it to my students. Then I have them talk about it in small groups, maybe in pairs, and then they try to put their heads together, they vote again. Then we look at the bar graph all together, and then I use that to kind of guide discussion, right? And so I would say, a lot of you went with 4. What's your reasoning? Can you explain your reasoning for answer 4? What about 3? How did you rule out 1 and 2? Those types of questions. And depending on the size of the class, you can lead a pretty good class discussion based on the results from here. Are you wondering what the right answer is? Yes. Should I tell you what the right answer is? I mean, some of you are right and some of you are wrong, right? Yeah. Yeah. Have I created a time for telling yet? Are you ready to hear a little bit? Okay. This is a beautiful question. In fact, in my classroom, I'll sometimes have students simulate this, right? You can actually kind of flip coins or flip clickers if you don't have coins, and we can, pretend how many of you got 2 boys, how many of you got, if you flip coins, how many of you got 2 heads, how many of you got 2 tails, how many of you got 1 of each, right? We could do all that right now, but maybe I should just tell you the answer. Is that, okay, all right. So most of you are wrong. It's 1 boy and 1 girl. It's the right answer. All right, excellent. So again, in class, we kind of discuss our way through it. I'm just going to tell you, though. You think about twin 1 and twin 2, right? One twin is born first, one twin is born second, right? The first twin is either a boy or a girl. The second twin is either a boy or a girl. And I'm a mathematician, so I'm going to round those odds to 50-50, although I know biologically they're not quite 50-50. They're very close. So you either have a boy and a boy, or a boy and a girl, or a girl and a boy, or a girl and a girl. Those 4 outcomes are equally likely, but 2 of them look the same. 1 of each, right? So there's actually a 50% chance of having 1 of each, 25% chance of twin girls, 25% chance of twin boys. So you were not expecting a math lesson today, I imagine. But my point here is that when most of you get it wrong, and I tell you you're wrong, you're actually a little more interested to know what the right answer is and what you missed about it, right? And so it's one thing. So on the one level, I had all of you commit to an answer, right? Well, we didn't have clickers to go around, but most of you actually had to press a button, right? You commit to an answer. When your answer is wrong, you're going to want to know why. When you see that most students were wrong, you're really going to want to know why. And so this idea of kind of having students answer questions incorrectly is kind of powerful, right? I wouldn't want my students to miss this question on a test. I'd want them to actually do well. But in class, I ask them clicker questions kind of because I want them to get it wrong, because I want them to see what they don't understand, and then be interested in hearing what the explanation is. So here's another quick example. This is from psychology. This is a pretty standard kind of psychology classroom experiment. Bill Hill at Kennesaw State University, I interviewed him for my book on clickers. He will give students a list of words like this, and he'll put them on screen for 10 seconds, and then he'll take it off, and he'll ask clicker questions. Do you remember seeing this word? Do you remember seeing this word? Yes or no? And you can see how many students actually remember seeing the word. And he's trying to demonstrate a few effects here. One is that we tend to remember words at the start of the list. We tend to remember words at the end of the list, although not quite as well. And we tend to forget the words in the middle of the list. We also tend to think the word needle is on the list when in fact it is not. These are all words associated with needle, but the word needle is not actually there. So, again, having the clickers allows you to do this kind of experiment very quickly, show students data that may convince them of certain psychological responses that are very common. When students see their own data up on screen, they realize, oh yeah, okay, we do function that way. So, lots more in using clickers in my book for this purpose and many other purposes. But I want to point out one kind of principle here that's important, and this is the principle of prior knowledge. And times for telling are important. Prior knowledge is really important here. When students come into a classroom, they're not just kind of, having information dumped in their head. They're trying to make sense of information, given what they already know. And so if you can encourage students through technology to access their prior knowledge and their experiences, the perceptions, perspectives, and misconceptions they bring with them, they can help to start to kind of access those and then make sense of this new information in light of that. And so confronting misconceptions is one way to do this, but any way you can do to kind of get students' prior knowledge kind of up in the air, out in the open, it's going to help them kind of reconcile the new information with the old. Okay. So that's one kind of key principle. Let me talk about another one here. Practice with feedback. And so this is really key. So it's also adorable. Here's this little guy with his skateboard and his pads all over him, right? I mean, he's going to get a lot of feedback as he practices skateboarding for the first time. Hopefully not hard feedback, but that's what the pads are for. But I mean, this is a key principle of learning, actually. I was actually at a talk last week at Vanderbilt. We had Eric Mazur, who's a physics instructor at Harvard, come in, and he makes the point that if you think about how you learned the important skills that you use in your jobs on a daily basis, right? You really learned those skills when you started practicing those skills, right? You sat in lecture and maybe got something, but you really had to kind of learn them through practice, trial and error, getting feedback, what works, what doesn't. And that's what our students need as well. And so again, no matter what kind of technological environment we're in, face-to-face, online, what have you, students need a chance to practice the skills that you're trying to help them develop. And they need feedback on that practice so they know what they're getting right and what they're not getting right. Right? So a couple of examples of using technology for this that I think are pretty interesting. This is one of my favorite uses of Twitter, although I have another favorite one I'll talk about in my session tomorrow. This is Monica Rankin. She teaches history at UT Dallas, I believe it is, the University of Texas, Dallas. And she used Twitter in the classroom to enhance the class discussion that was happening. So the students would read the textbook before class, and then they would come to class and have small group discussions. She gave them a series of questions to kind of think about the reading, and they'd discuss in small groups. And what she used Twitter for was a couple of reasons. She encouraged students to tweet their questions and observations and comments about the reading. They used a hashtag so they could find each other's tweets very quickly. What happened was that a question or an idea from this small group might get read by that small group over there and would influence the discussion over there. And so you had this interesting kind of cross-pollination as students were testing out ideas, testing out hypotheses, testing out arguments they were making about the history, and getting feedback from each other, not just in their small group, but across the classroom as well. The other thing that happened is that Monica, and this was a pretty big class. She had 50 or 60 students. She wasn't reading all of these tweets herself. She was circulating and talking to the students. But she had a TA who was monitoring all the tweets. And when there were really important questions or tweets that really needed her feedback, the instructor's feedback, they had a little break every 15 or 20 minutes. They'd say, OK, time out. Focus back on me, the instructor. Here are a few tweets I want to respond to, questions that are coming up in a lot of your groups. And so that was a chance, again, for her to give some feedback to the students. So again, they were practicing their ideas in this kind of semi-public setting on Twitter, getting feedback and corrections and whatnot from each other, but also from the instructor as well. And I thought this was a nice way to take what would have worked pretty well as small group discussion and actually add this extra layer to it. That was pretty cool. I did something, I'll share a few examples from my own class. This was, again, a statistics course. One of the things I wanted my students to learn were some data visualization skills in the statistics course, because I think this is an increasingly important component of statistics. I had a whole bunch of engineers, and so what I had them do, I showed them a few examples, and then I gave them this rather complex data set around carbon footprint data for different nations. And I said, see what you can do to visualize these data, right? What variables you're going to look at, how are you going to represent them through axes or color or bubble size or what have you. And I said, just draw something, right? If you have a marker that works a little bit better, but just draw something. And then I said something that really threw them off, right? I mean, this was all like, yes, yes, Dr. Bruff, you're asking us to do work. I understand that. And then I said, get out your cell phones. And at Vanderbilt, the instructors don't say that very often. I said, get out your cell phones, take a photo of what you've drawn, and then email it to me. And most of them had some capability to do that. They were working in pairs anyway. So my TA went around and she used her cell phone to get a few photos. So we didn't worry too much about it. And so in my inbox, I had all of these images coming up. And so I could put them on the big screen and say, here, OK, Donna, tell me about what you did here on this one. How did you visualize things? Here's what I like about it. Here's what's a little more confusing, right? And this one over here, she went to town on the aesthetics of hers, right? It's actually structured very similarly. The bigger the person, the greater the quantity. But again, it was a nice, quick way for me to get, this was 75 students in the room. And so I was able to kind of see what they were thinking. They were practicing. I gave them feedback at the front of the room. Technology helped make that happen. The key idea here is formative assessment. Does anyone know what this image is? Any guesses? X-ray of a laptop, yes. I've heard satellite photo in the past as well. I thought that was fun. No, it's just an X-ray of a laptop. It's a MacBook. One of the things I like about, like if I want to know what's inside, Phil, you had a MacBook, right? If I want to know what's inside there, right, I have to do something to get in there, right? I use an X-ray, I use a screwdriver, I use a hammer. I need some way to kind of get in there, right? We're going to see what's hammer. Yeah, we're done. And in a similar way, when we're thinking about what's happening in our students' heads, what they're learning, what they're understanding, what they're not understanding, what misconceptions they have, we have to do something to kind of make that more visible so that then we can respond to it. It's not unlike what Phil was saying about all the data that we get out of these MOOCs around student learning. We know what questions they miss. We know what videos they watch after they, right before they get the question right. You have all this data on what students are doing in the system. And if you pick the right data, you can actually use that in a pretty adaptive manner. And whether you're in a MOOC or in a traditional class, a lot of these methods, the two examples I just showed you, make more visible the little bits of learning that students are doing along the way. And that's really valuable data. We call this formative assessment. It's not assessment to say good job, bad job. It's formative, so that I can figure out what you're learning, what you're not learning. You can figure out what you're learning, what you're not learning, and I can give you feedback on it. And this is a key principle of learning. Students need this formative assessment frequently along the way. And technology can give us more opportunities to do that. Okay. So the next principle, and I just love this image. See what this is? This is a library, someone's personal library. They've organized the books in the library by the color of their spine. I hope one day to have enough books so that I can do this. It's just awesome. So the idea here is organization, right? Knowledge organizations. And so let me show you a couple of little diagrams here. This is from a book called How Learning Works, which is just a fantastic summary of lots of what we know from cognitive science. So if you think about kind of the mental models we have in our head of our disciplines, right? Novices have, our students often, have simpler or more fragmented mental models. They have an idea here, but they're not very well connected. They're not very richly connected. They're not very complexly connected. Right? Experts, on the other hand, have very well connected mental models. Right? It may be a very hierarchical model. It may not be. But they see ideas and connections among lots of things in the domain. And this is really what drives a lot of adaptive problem solving. Right? If you encounter a new problem in your domain and you're not quite sure how to solve it, you've got to start making sense of the bits of it in terms of what you already know. And if what you already know is very well organized and very well connected, you have a really rich knowledge organization, then you're much more able to solve problems, see patterns, access the knowledge that you have. And so an important principle here is we need to help our students develop more complex and useful mental models and knowledge organizations. Okay? So that's the idea here. There's a quote I like from this book. When students are provided with an organizational structure in which to fit new knowledge, they learn more effectively and efficiently than when they are left to deduce this conceptual structure for themselves. So let me give a little example. So imagine you're a first-year undergraduate student, and maybe you want to major in business or the humanities or something, and you're walking into a chemistry class, and you look at your chemistry textbook, right? Now, I don't know about here, but in Vanderbilt, the chemistry textbooks have about 1,200 pages in them. They're gigantic, right? And it's like every chemistry fact I can imagine seems to be in this textbook. I flip through it, and there's just terms and diagrams and pictures, all these facts, all this information. And when you look at it, you know the phrase, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? It's all trees. It's all details. When you walk in as a novice, you don't know how things are related. You don't know what things are more or less important. And so if all you see are details, it's very confusing. And our students, a student in that position, has to then kind of start to put that together in their head. What's connected, what's not connected, what's more important, what's less important, what's the hierarchy. All this stuff is very hard. And so what the authors here argue is that if we can give students some structures for doing that, again, to make more visible the things that are going on in their heads, they can actually put those knowledge organizations together better and more quickly. So here's an example. So this is from a colleague of mine at Vanderbilt University, Tamara Carley. She teaches, she's a grad student. She teaches in Earth and Environmental Science. And she was assisting, being TA for this course on mineral identification. And in this case, I'm not going to get into a lot of geology. It's not my expertise. But she talked about, in this course, the students have to learn things at the mega scale, right? The plate tectonics and earthquakes and things like that. They have to look at things at the macro scale, anything they could see with their eyes, right? Properties of minerals that you can observe with your eye. And then the micro scale, things you would need a microscope to see as well. right? Molecular structure, things like that. And so the students are having to understand content on all three levels. And I think most importantly, they're trying to see the connections between these levels. There are properties at the micro scale that influence what happens at the macro scale. There's properties at the macro scale that influence what's happening at the mega scale. And so this is a lot of content, and it's very complex. And it's hard for her students to kind of put it all together. And before I show you kind of what she did, I want you to think for just a second about multi-scale content that may be part of something that you teach. So let me give you one very different example to kind of see where I'm going with this. So imagine in an art history course, you can look at a painting, right? An individual painting. You can look at an artist and all that artist's paintings, or you can look at a movement, right, among multiple artists over time. And again, you have the same kind of property. You have properties at each level, but they influence each other. There are connections, right? If you wanted to go one further, you could even look at brush strokes. That would be even smaller, right, within one painting. So take a minute. Oh, so do we have time for this? I'm mindful of our time. So think for a minute. I'm not going to have you talk about this one, because I want to show you what she did to try to help students address this. But imagine some kind of multi-scale content that you might have in the courses that you teach. Now, here's what she had her students do. She had her students use Prezi, the same tool I'm using to present here. And one of the nice parts about Prezi is you may have noticed I can zoom in and out as I go. And so she had her students create multi-scale zooming concept maps to try to map all of this out. So let me show you a little example of what one of her students did. And I think I have this up and loaded. Okay, so he starts down with protons and neutrons, then the nucleus of an atom, the atom itself, electrons. Now, he didn't mean this as a presentation, right? This is a map for him to navigate at will. I'm moving through it fairly fast, so if it makes you a little dizzy, you might close your eyes. It's not meant to be seen this fast, right? But he talks about different properties. He's putting all the content from the course together, and he's zooming out every time there's a physical scale difference in the content that he's talking about. And so let me cut to the chase here a little bit. If I just keep zooming out, you start to see how all of these things are connected, right? Symmetry, thermodynamics, polymorphs. This is all at the macro level. And then you start to get at the mega level stuff, right? So I think this was a brilliant way to help those students start to put this together, right? Using technology to give them a tool they can use to articulate their knowledge organization, right? She actually had them work on this several times during the semester. So as they learned new material, they had to integrate it into their existing knowledge map. And over time, using the zoom feature to try to connect to this multi-scale piece. Now, I said earlier that one of my favorite educational technologies is wheels on chairs. I did something a little bit similar. I was teaching a writing course, actually. We were reading a novel. I don't teach a lot of writing courses. I'm a mathematician. This was the first time I'd ever taught a novel, right? I don't know how to teach novels. So I thought, well, I know what I can do. We can map this thing, right? And so in this case, there are actually arguments made in this novel kind of for and against this one particular issue. And so I had students work in small groups, identify some of the arguments for or against that were made in the novel, right? The pro arguments are on the kind of yellowish-green Post-it notes. The con arguments are in the red Post-it notes. They put them up on the chalkboard. They drew arrows to connect. This argument rebuts this one. This one is an argument against this, right? Wonderful class activity. It helped them to start to see the structure behind the arguments that we were dealing with. Technology, right? No power cord, no internet, but it worked beautifully. Okay. I have another clicker question for you. So who's familiar with the game World of Warcraft? You ever heard of this? It's one of these online role-playing games. You fight dragons and orcs and whatnot, right? Wait, really, not a lot of people familiar. Okay, this may not go well, but we'll see. So online game, you take on a role, right? There's a lot of fighting involved. You may team up with other players and to kind of fight bigger monsters or take on bigger challenges. Okay, so it's one of these online role-playing games. So here's my clicker question for you. Let me get the voting started and then I'll read it. In a 2008 study of over 1,000 posts made to a World of Warcraft discussion forum, it was a discussion forum where players of this game went to discuss the game that they were playing. What percent of posts involved social knowledge construction, solving problems through discussion, knowledge sharing, and debate, as opposed to mere social banter? Okay, so what percentage of them involves social knowledge construction? If you would, talk about it, find a friend with a clicker, talk about it, put your heads together, and vote when you're ready. Go. All right, most of you went high. Okay, excellent. Well, I won't keep you in suspense quite so long this time. The correct answer is E, 86%. You did a little better on that one. Not by much. 60% of you still failed, but whatever. Right? But I didn't give you a lot to go on. No one had done the reading, so that's fine. So this is a 2009 article by Constance Steinkuhler and Sean Duncan. They collected a whole lot of posts, thousands and thousands of posts from this online discussion forum devoted to this online role-playing game. And then they coded up all of the posts. So they categorized them by the type of post they were. 86% were social knowledge construction, as I was describing. 58% used systems-based reasoning. So they were trying to kind of unpack the systems used in the game. 37% of the posts used counter-arguments. 28% used data. They actually had Excel spreadsheets where they were tracking their performance in certain parts of the game over time and arguing the best way to defeat this enemy is this, and here's my data, right? 28% used data. 11% used very sophisticated model-based reasoning, right? This is kind of, I didn't expect to see this in a post about, they took this game very seriously. Essentially, many of them were trying to reverse engineer the underlying code of the game to try to understand how they could win at it.
Cheat codes.
Right. Not cheat codes. That would be the easy way out, right? They were doing something much more sophisticated. 65% displayed an evaluative epistemology in which knowledge is treated as an open-ended process of evaluation and argument on Worlds of Warcraft. Orcs. Okay. Now, what fuels this? Well, okay, if you think about it, gosh, I would love for my statistics students to take the same approach to their learning in my course, right? And what's different? Well, in part, you have a community that has a shared interest, and they're really interested in learning from each other. And that's a learning principle we can tap into. So I like to talk about, there's a lot of research on motivation, and often you hear about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators. And that's all fine and good. But I kind of feel like I may not be able to convince my students to intrinsically like math. Calculus is calculus, right? But I might be able to help them like learning about math. And so if I can turn my classroom into a real learning community, where students desire, I'm tapping into these social motivations that we all have. We want to connect with others, right? We want to be a part of communities. And once we're in those, we want to share, right? We want to share what we know. We want to share our questions. We want to learn from each other. These are very natural motivators that we have. And often our educational systems don't really leverage these very well, right? Students take the course because they have to take the course, not because they want to learn with others. But there are ways that we can use technology to actually tap into some of this. So a couple of quick examples. This is from Roberto Garcia. He teaches English at Vanderbilt. He's a huge fan of blogs. He didn't use blogs at all 3 years ago, and now he uses them for almost all of his courses. It's really revolutionized what he does in his class. This was for a course he taught in William Blake and Enlightenment Media. He would have students do the reading. They would reflect on the reading through blog posts that they could see each other's posts, right? And this is the key ingredient, is that before they came to class, students had already done some thinking about the class material, they had done some writing about the class material, and they had read each other's writing about the class material. Class discussions then revolved around these posts that the students had read. The students started to see each other as people they could actually learn from. They weren't dependent on Umberto, the professor, for their information. They actually started to see each other as kind of co-learners in this whole process. And to hear him talk about it, it's almost moving. This one image is they had a really great discussion in class one day, and Umberto was scribing all over the whiteboard. And a student said, let me take a photo of that and put it up on the blog because we're all going to want this later. Right? That, I think, is pretty powerful. This is a tool I just learned about last week. I said Eric Mazur was visiting Vanderbilt, and he uses this, and I hadn't heard about it until then. It's a tool called NB for Nota Bene. It comes out of MIT, and it's basically a collaborative annotation tool. So under certain conditions, you can upload a PDF of a textbook to this tool. Students can then log in. When they see something in the reading before class that they don't understand, they can highlight it, see the kind of blue box here, and then they can ask a question about it. What was the result? Does the fact of the proof, blah, blah, blah. One student asks a question. Other students can see that question and respond to it. or not. The student can make it private, right? But the students can actually start to see each other's questions about the reading embedded in the context of the reading. And you, the instructor, what you get is basically this kind of PDF of the reading with these hot spots where there were lots of student questions. They glow red, and you know that's something you're going to have to talk about in class that day. So there's a lot of things going on here, but one thing I'll point out is that having students read the text kind of in public with each other and answer each other's questions, that's really powerful, right? I hear faculty all the time say, well, they never do the reading, right? Well, you know here that they're doing the reading, and part of the reason they're doing the reading is that it's a social experience. It's not just prep for class. It's being part of a learning community. So both of these tools work really well in what Phil said earlier is the flipped classroom. This is not actually how you flip a classroom. You don't put all the chairs on the ceiling, although that would be fun for an experiment, I guess. No, the flipped classroom is this model. I mean, this traditional approach is that you transfer information to students during class. These are from assimilated out of class. They go make sense of it. They do assignments, they do homework, they study, right? That's the traditional model. Eric Mazur likes to argue that the assimilation step is the harder of the two, actually. So maybe we should do that in the classroom when we're around to help each other. And so the flipped approach says, do the transfer out of class before class. Have them do the reading, watch some videos, whatever. Get that first exposure to the content. Class time, especially face-to-face class time in a physical location, is precious. So use that for the hard stuff. And that's where many of these other tools come in, right? The practice with feedback, the formative assessment, the times for telling. That's what you can do with your class time if you've had students prepared ahead of time. Okay. One more quick idea, and then I've got one final clicker question for you. There's one more idea in the literature that I don't see this cited a heck of a lot, but I love the idea. There's an elegance to it. Legitimate peripheral participation. It's not quite as catchy as some of the other terms I've thrown at you, but legitimate peripheral participation. And so my image here is of this kind of spiral thing. And the idea is having students participate in the work of the discipline or the domain, perhaps peripherally at first, but in legitimate ways. Right? So they're actually doing some of the work of the discipline. Now, the simple version of this is that if you have chemistry students, you have them wash beakers in the lab. Right? Someone has to wash the beakers. Right? That is legitimate work. It's rather peripheral to real chemistry research, though. Right? So the idea here is to have students do work that is more like the work done in the discipline, and to give them lots of feedback and structure as they do that. And sometimes technology can help with this. So a couple of examples. Larry Sabula teaches, I'm going to forget where he teaches, somewhere in the northwest of the US. Teaches history. He has this really interesting project. Let me zoom in on one of these. He calls it his ghost sign project. So I notice you have a lot of new construction in this city. Just a little bit. In many American cities, there's old construction, and there are signs on the side of buildings that were painted there years and years, decades ago, often for signs, advertisements for companies that are no longer in existence, right? And so these are called ghost signs. The sign is still there, the business is long gone. So what Larry has his students do, and these are history majors, they go out with their cameras in pairs, they search the city for ghost signs, they take good photos of those ghost signs, they come back to campus, they research the businesses represented by those ghost signs. And they find out, what was this business? What happened to it, right? What's the history behind this ghost sign? And they put together these they use Flickr to share some of these ideas. They post a photo on Flickr. They have all these annotations, right? They write these papers based on these ghost signs. And so they use their cell phones to take the pictures. They use Flickr to help communicate this, right? And they're doing real work of historians, right? In small ways, with lots of help and structure and support, but they're doing the real work of historians here. In my course, I said I had my students do a lot with data visualization. And so at the end of the semester, what I had them do were create infographics. And you see these all over on the web now. Kind of data visualizations that are a little fun and a little interesting. But I wanted my students to really understand how can you represent data in visual ways that are really meaningful. And so they worked in teams, and they created these infographics. And so you don't have to drill down, but you can kind of see they're representing data in many different ways here, visually. Perhaps in some traditional ways, right? But then also some non-traditional ways. This was one on pizza prices versus income level around the county where I live. And they kind of styled it as a restaurant, a pizza place menu. And so they're doing some really interesting work here. One of the things that I think is interesting about one of these students' projects, it's not up here, but they were looking at resistors. They were a bunch of engineering students, so they were looking at resistors, and they evaluated the company that made the resistors. They evaluated that company's claims about certain properties around the resistors. As it turns out, the company's claims were held up by the statistical analysis that my students did. They did this really nice infographic, right? I put all the infographics up on my course blog, so they were public to the world. The company who made the resistors was like Joe's Resistors or something like this. Joe Knows Resistors. I don't know what it was, but anyway, Joe found my student's infographic and responded to the blog post that shared it and said, "Great, I'm glad glad our claims held up here," right? So my student's work was actually noticed by the company that they were evaluating because I shared it on my blog. And I'll talk more about that idea in my session tomorrow. But I'll just kind of make two claims here about how technology enhanced these assignments. One is that in both cases, students were better able to do the work of the discipline because they were using tools that are used by those disciplines, right? Historians work with photos, so students were creating photos, right? Statisticians work with all kinds of software to create data visualizations, and my students had to do that as well. The other is, in both cases, the technology helped to make my students' work more public and actually brought an audience to their work that I think brings authenticity to that work when they have that real audience. Okay, so 5 big ideas here. I'll end with this because I'm kind of curious what you're thinking. As you think about using technology to enhance student learning, which of these principles seems most useful to you? So one more quick clicker question. And again, if you're sharing a clicker, you may have to talk about this briefly. Times for telling, formative assessment, knowledge organization, social motivations, or this legitimate peripheral participation? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say last call because I know we're over time. I'm kind of curious to see which of these resonated with you, and you may be curious to see which resonated with your peers a little bit. Thanks for voting quickly. All right, social motivations, number 1, followed by knowledge organizations. Great. Well, again, lots of stuff to talk about here during the conference. I hope I've given you a few interesting ideas that you may play with in your own teaching. And again, I'd be glad to talk with you further about these as we see each other at the conference. Thanks for your time and attention.